Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, by Philip S. Gorski and Samuel L. Perry. Foreword by Jamar Tisby. Narrated by Keith Sellon-Wright. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Foreword. I thought I had endured the worst racism that Christians could spew at me. Then came November 2016. In a bracing turn of events, a minority of voters elected Donald J. Trump as the 45th President of the United States. To add to the head-spinning element of the moment, exit polls showed that white evangelical Christians who voted had pulled the lever for Trump at a rate of about 81%. I remember staying up late on election night as the results rolled in. I sat alone, my wife having long since gone to bed with the resolution that seeing the results live on television would not change the outcome. It was dark, and I was toggling my eyes between the television screen and the Twitter feed on my phone. When it was clear that Trump had won, it became nearly impossible for me to grab and hold on to a single thought as my mind and emotions struggled to keep up with this new development. Finally, a feeling of dread settled over me as I reckoned with the fact that a blatant opponent of racial justice would soon occupy the highest political office in our nation. Then my thoughts focused on matters closer to home. My church. I attended a congregation that was predominantly white and evangelical. By the percentages and from my own interactions with them, I knew that many of my fellow churchgoers had voted for Trump. I couldn't shake the pain I felt. I had made no secret about my concerns about this man, particularly his long record of trafficking in racial stereotypes and coddling racists. How could I go to church that Sunday with people who so clearly misunderstood and perhaps even dismissed my reality as a black person in America? How could I sing, pray, and exchange pleasantries with folks who seemed not to care what their favored politicians' plans would mean for me, my family, our community, and our country? I knew I wouldn't be able to fake it, and I didn't want to try. None of what I was feeling was unique to me. From my work with black Christians all over the country, I knew that many others had similar misgivings about their faith communities leading up to and in the wake of the presidential election. While they may have shared their concerns privately with trusted friends and family members, I went and turned on the mic to record a podcast. My friend Bo interviewed me about my reactions to the election, and I spoke honestly. I said, I don't feel safe worshiping at my predominantly white evangelical church this Sunday. I went on to describe the sense of betrayal I felt from white evangelicals as a whole, but how I still valued individual white Christians for their commitments to racial justice. I sensed my words would sound jarring to some, so I spoke with as much nuance as I could muster. It didn't help. Not long after we released the podcast episode, my mentions on social media turned into a dumpster fire of racist jabs and diatribes. One meme depicted a cartoonish young black man shaking hands with a chimpanzee, while the caption called me a woke N blank 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 Another called me a woke evangelical. On a follow-up blog post I wrote, someone else commented that I was merely engaging in moral posturing, and had succumbed to the ethically paralyzing and emotionalized position of racial solidarity and sympathy. A fellow church member, one with whom I had never had an in-depth conversation, commented on Twitter that my views on Christianity, Trump, and the election were liberal and worldly. In the aftermath, several think pieces appeared that criticized me, and the denomination and religious communities of which I was a part quickly became sites of marginalization and ostracism. For 3 weeks, I could not go online without the little muscle under my left eye twitching. The stress had caused a physiological response in which I essentially winced every time I opened my laptop. I became conditioned to expect the worst, and when I thought the rhetoric couldn't spiral any lower, it always did. I later learned that what I experienced is a form of racial trauma, and several years later I am still processing its effects through therapy, prayer, and reflection. I think part of why the criticism affected me so deeply was that I couldn't name exactly the forces that were acting against me. I didn't have a category to explain the toxic combination of racism, religion, and politics that had taken over my life. That's where learning about white Christian nationalism and the work of Philip Gorski, Samuel Perry, and other scholars researching the subject helped so much. The concept of white Christian nationalism encompasses the many ways bigotry, prejudice, xenophobia, patriarchy, and racism show up in Christian guise. More than merely providing a nomenclature for a sociocultural phenomenon, white Christian nationalism helps explain the mindsets and beliefs that lead to certain behaviors that seem so contradictory. How could self-described born-again Christians who placed so much emphasis on morality champion a philandering, arrogant, and cruel politician like Donald Trump? How did wearing a mask during a viral pandemic become an issue of religious freedom? Why did so many Christians who quote Romans 13 about being subject to the governing authorities support an attempted insurrection at the Capitol building? Do racism and white supremacy form the subtext of all their beliefs? The answer to these questions are historical, contextual, and complex. But the flag and the cross offers a glimpse into a system that has an internal, if frustrating, logic of its own. Gorski and Perry give clear and deeply researched examinations of critical ideas such as Christian libertarianism, as well as idiosyncratic notions of order, freedom, and the use of violence. The authors go further. They show how white Christian nationalism is not simply a set of beliefs, but a narrative, a deep story that keeps getting told, retold, and embellished to suit the desires of those who buy into it. The flag and the cross leaves us with a dire but necessary warning. While it would be comforting to think of the insurrection at the Capitol as an isolated event that won't be repeated in the near future, the data that Gorski and Perry compiled lead in a different direction. They conclude that not only is another violent power grab possible, but a second eruption would likely be larger and more violent than the first, large enough to bury American democracy for at least a generation, and maybe longer. Others concur with their assessment. In 2020, the Department of Homeland Security issued its annual Homeland Threat Assessment. Officials warned that among domestic violent extremists, DVEs, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, WSEs, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Although white supremacist extremists and white Christian nationalists are not identical, there is some overlap and, like the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups, white supremacist extremists easily co-opt Christian symbols and ideas for violent purposes. Given the historic and ongoing dangers posed by white Christian nationalism and its related movements, Gorski and Perry insist on urgently and aggressively combating this ideology. The convincing research presented in The Flag and the Cross has led me to the following assessment. White Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to the witness of the Church in the United States today. It is not, as many white Christian nationalists would contend, critical race theory or the 1619 Project or wokeness that push people away from the Church and hinders democracy. White Christian nationalism does that. The information in The Flag and the Cross may not convince the white Christian nationalists in your midst to change their minds or their actions. This audiobook will, however, give you more confidence to engage different and often pernicious viewpoints from an informed perspective. You can use the quotes from Paul Weyrich found in the audiobook to describe how making it harder to vote has been an intentional strategy of white Christian nationalists to maintain political power. You can point out the plethora of Christian symbols at the Capitol insurrection and ask why so many thought that Christ himself sanctioned their actions. You can cite statistical data and polling numbers to show how xenophobia, a narrow interpretation of we the people, and an aversion to structural explanations of inequality are all positively correlated to white Christian nationalism. Although our specific stories may differ, we have all been affected by white Christian nationalism. There may be people in your church or faith community who adhere to its principles. Perhaps you have family members, co-workers, or friends you've had to confront or even cut off because of this malicious ideology. You may have had to leave a space where you thought you belonged because you refused to parrot the party line. Everyone in the United States has to deal with the threats that white Christian nationalism poses to civil rights and democracy itself. Since the impact of white Christian nationalism is so ubiquitous, The Flag and the Cross is not an audiobook you can simply listen to. The knowledge this book imparts must be absorbed and applied. We all have to be able to spot white Christian nationalism in everyday life, current events, legislative actions, and rhetoric. We have to become adept at addressing white Christian nationalism when and where we see it. This will take a rare kind of courage that stands against the status quo at great risk to oneself. But we have no other choice. The stakes are too high. Apathy and indifference make us complicit in the demise of our nation. We must use the data assembled by Gorski and Perry in The Flag and the Cross to fight white Christian nationalism as if our entire democracy depends on it. Indeed, it does. Jamar Tisby. Introduction. Eruption. The chaos of the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021 was bewildering for many, in part because the violent riot was also a riot of images: a wooden cross and a wooden gallows, Christian flags and Confederate flags, Jesus saves and don't tread on me banners, button-down shirts and bulletproof vests. But these confusing and even seemingly contradictory symbols are part of an increasingly familiar ideology: white Christian nationalism. This audiobook is a primer on white Christian nationalism, what it is, when it emerged, how it works, and where it's headed. White Christian nationalism is one of the oldest and most powerful currents in American politics. But until the insurrection, it was invisible to most Americans. It was invisible to most conservative white Christians because for decades it has been the water they swim in and the air they breathe. It was invisible to most secular progressives because they live in a bubble of their own in which white Christian nationalism seems fringe rather than mainstream. But that bubble was burst on January 6, 2021, by the white-hot rage of pro-Trump insurrectionists. That rage had been building since long before the presidential election. Throughout 2020, President Trump routinely spouted debunked claims of mail-in ballots from pets, dead people, and undocumented immigrants, virtually promising rampant voter fraud come November. Following his election loss, he desperately stoked his followers' rage via Twitter, sowing lies about a stolen election. His efforts were fanned by pro-Trump pundits on the Christian right and loyal congressional allies like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and Matt Gaetz, who helped propagate his big lie. The Capitol insurrection was like the eruption of a volcano. The pressure had been building for decades. The election simply sent that pressure shooting toward the surface, where it erupted into violence on January 6th. The buildup was partly the result of propaganda and fear-mongering facilitated by increased polarization, foreign interference in elections, and the social media revolution. But it was also the result of slow-moving demographic and cultural transitions. The numerical influence of conservative white Protestants is declining. The U.S. population is becoming less white and more secular. The nation has become less powerful and more unequal. The tectonic plates of history were colliding with each other, creating new fissures and mounting tensions. The election of Barack Obama was one result of these gradual shifts. The unexpected victory of Donald Trump another, the Capitol insurrection yet a third. There are more to come. Geologists study volcanic eruptions for 4 reasons. 1. To understand the shape of the landscape. 2. To uncover the forces that have formed it. 3. To explain why they erupt when they do. And 4. To forecast eruptions and avoid catastrophes. We are sociologists, but we follow the geologists' lead. We begin by mapping the landscape of contemporary white Christian nationalism, what it is and is not, who does and does not adhere to it, and what they do and do not believe. We then drill down below the surface, through the various layers of white Christian nationalism that have built up over time to the biblical bedrock on which it rests. After that, we take a closer look at the role white Christian nationalism has played in American politics in recent years, both as an ideology and as a political strategy, from the Obama presidency and the rise of the Tea Party, through Trump's election, presidency, and failed re-election, to the attempted insurrection of 2021. We conclude with predictions about America's future and how we can avoid the big one, a political earthquake that could topple American democracy. Our arguments. In this book, we address 4 fundamental questions. 1. What is white Christian nationalism? 2. When did it emerge? 3. How does it work politically? And finally, 4. Where might it be headed tomorrow? White Christian nationalism is a deep story about America's past and a vision of its future. It includes cherished assumptions about what America was and is, but also what it should be. We borrow the deep story idea from sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild. In her 2016 book, Strangers in Their Own Land, she recounts the lessons she learned during the 5 years she spent talking with white working-class Americans in the oil-refining regions of rural Louisiana. Their deep story goes something like this. People like them have been standing in line, waiting patiently for their chance at the American dream. But up ahead, they see people cutting in line. Immigrants and minorities and other people who haven't paid their dues. What's worse, they see politicians helping the line cutters, liberal politicians like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So they vote for conservative politicians who, they believe, will send those people to the back of the line where they belong. The unstated and incorrect assumption is that white people were here first. The deep story sounds a lot like Make America Great Again. It helps explain why so many rural whites voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and again in 2020. What makes deep stories stories is that they function like a bare-bones movie script. They include a cast of heroes and villains and well-worn and familiar plots that events are supposed to follow. And like many classic scripts, they are made and remade with tweaked storylines and new leading men. What makes deep stories deep is that they have deep roots in a culture. Deep stories have been told and retold so many times and across so many generations that they feel natural and true. even, and perhaps especially, when they are at odds with history. In sum, a deep story is more myth than history. More precisely, it is a mythological version of history. White Christian nationalism's deep story goes something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were traditional Christians who based the nation's founding documents on Christian principles. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it has been so successful. And the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences both inside and outside our borders. Like any story, this one has its heroes. White conservative Christians, usually native-born men. It also has its villains, racial, religious, and cultural outsiders. The plot revolves around conflicts between the noble and worthy us, the rightful heirs of wealth and power, and the undeserving them who conspire to take what is ours. Sometimes the conflicts culminate in violence that restores white Christians to what they believe is their rightful place atop America's racial and religious hierarchy. The heroes are those who defend the purity and property of the white Christian nation, with violence when necessary. But this story is a myth. The religious views of the founders ranged widely, from atheism through deism and Unitarianism to Congregationalism, baptism, and even Roman Catholicism. The Declaration and the Constitution drew on various influences, including classical liberalism, for example, Locke, and civic republicanism, for example, Machiavelli. More than a little of the nation's wealth and prosperity were derived from stolen land and slave labor. These are all well-established historical facts. At this point, the skeptical listener might wonder what's Christian about this deep story. It is Christian because the vast majority of those who believe this story identify as such. It is also Christian insofar as it draws on particular readings of the Bible. And because it draws on the Bible, the story sounds orthodox and traditional to many mainstream Christians. Whether this reading of the Bible is really Christian is a question for theologians, not sociologists. But, as we will hear, this deep story is not only widespread, it is also centuries old. The people who wove this story together, the scriptwriters, if you will, are not fringe figures either. On the contrary, they have included and still do famous Christian preachers, writers, and lay people who were squarely within the mainstream of their times. Which is why white Christian nationalism still flows along undisturbed in many regions of mainstream Christianity, even today. But that is not the only place where it can be found. White Christian nationalism has also shaped American popular culture. Consider the post-apocalyptic genre of novels and movies such as The Road, or superhero comics and films such as Captain America. Today, the secularized version of white Christian nationalism is almost as important as the religious one. Though sometimes it is hard to distinguish between the two, as evidenced by the many cosplay crusaders among the Capitol insurrectionists and the overlaps between Christian prophecy belief and the QAnon conspiracy theory. But white Christian nationalism is not just a deep story about what was. It is also a political vision of what should be. First and foremost, of course, white Christian nationalists believe that America should be a Christian nation, or at least a nation ruled by Christians. And though the expectation of whiteness is rarely expressed explicitly, it is often clearly assumed in the sort of Christian that adherents of white Christian nationalism have in mind. Who counts as white and what counts as Christian has changed over time. White Christian nationalism's enemies have also changed, from Native Americans and Catholics to communists, black radicals, atheists, Muslims, and socialists, each taking their turn as the main threat to white Christian values. But there is more to the political vision than that. As we will show in the chapters ahead, contemporary proponents of white Christian nationalism also hold strong views on many other issues, including racial discrimination, religious freedom, government regulation, socialism, the welfare state, COVID lockdowns, voting, and the Capitol insurrection. Some of these views seem at odds with each other. Why would someone strongly favor institutionalizing Christianity as the national religion, but also claim that one of their top priorities is religious freedom? Why would someone strongly affirm that the government should advocate Christian values and yet support the use of torture or oppose gun regulations? And many of them don't have an obvious connection to Christianity at all. There is no commandment saying, "Thou shalt not wear a mask." What connects these stances to each other is a particular understanding of freedom, order, and violence with deep roots in American history. Freedom is understood in a libertarian way as freedom from restrictions, especially by the government. Order is understood in a hierarchical way with white Christian men at the top. And violence is seen as a righteous means of defending freedom and restoring order, means that are reserved to white Christian men. This understanding of freedom, order, and violence is the heart of white Christian nationalism. We can now start to see how the various pieces of the political vision fit together. Government regulation infringes on the freedom of white Christians. So do mask mandates and COVID lockdowns. Urban crime and racial riots threaten the social order. They must be met with force by the police, or, barring that, by good Christian men. Thus, the need for access to firearms. The general principle is this: white men must sometimes exercise righteous violence to defend their freedom and maintain social and racial order. It is freedom for us and authoritarian social order for them. This us versus them tribalism may seem unchristian, the glorification of violence even more so. But not if seen through the lens of the end times theology we mentioned earlier, with its sharp division between a good us and evil them, and its gory tales of spiritual warfare. The goal is to forever redeem and restore a lost world corrupted by outsiders. That won't happen without a fight. So, white Christian nationalism marches its adherents toward a bloody battle. This ethno-traditionalist impulse of white Christian nationalism is one of the things driving the authoritarian populism that has overwhelmed our cultural and political landscape in the last decade. It's why the highly regimented culture wars of the late 20th century have given way to the chaotic culture fights of the early 21st century. Demographic change is also a key factor. As white Christians approach minority status, white Christian nationalists are starting to turn against American democracy. After all, the basic principle of democratic government is majority rule. So long as white Christians were in the majority and could call the shots, they were willing to tolerate a certain amount of pluralism, provided that minorities did not insist too much on equality. Now faced with the prospect of minority status themselves, some members of the old white majority are embracing authoritarian politics as a means of protecting their freedom. Is their freedom really in danger? They surely believe that it is. White Christian nationalists sincerely believe that whites and Christians are the most persecuted groups in America. Consequently, they view efforts to expand access to the democratic process, such as removing obstacles to voter participation, as an existential threat to their political power. The United States cannot be both a truly multiracial democracy, a people of people and a nation of nations, and a white Christian nation at the same time. This is why white Christian nationalism has become a serious threat to American democracy, perhaps the most serious threat it now faces. Before saying more about what white...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?